Okay, good afternoon and welcome to the Technical Library. I am Mary Ray, and our guest storyteller this afternoon is a graduate of the University of Arizona. He spent some time in the Army, stationed in places like Fort Irwin, Fort Bliss, Korea, Desert Shield. After that, he was an archaeologist with the Forest Service in Oregon, Nebraska, South Dakota, and New Mexico. Spent some time with the BLM. And just prior to coming on board here at China Lake in 2007, he spent 2 years as the archaeologist over in Fallon. So I think he's well suited to our environments here. Today he's going to tell us a little bit about what future archaeologists will think of the remains of our buildings and the people who occupied them here at China Lake. Please join me in welcoming Mike Baskerville.
Well, thank you for inviting me here today. I always like to do these things because it gets me out of the usual paperwork grind that I do. A lot of people think that I spend a lot of time in the field when in reality I spend a lot of time staring at computer screens. Most of you are well aware of the history of China Lake. You know a lot of the background, and you've gained that either through reading books, or maybe in the case of China Lake, it's a pretty unique situation where families have, generations have worked on the base, and you've listened to your parents or your uncles and aunts that have worked here on China Lake. So this is not really the history of China Lake, but it's more of the history of China Lake as interpreted through the buildings located here on base. Most of you, when you think of archaeological artifacts, you think about pots, you think about projectile points, you think about woven sandals and baskets, things like that. And it's true, those are artifacts, and through those artifacts we learn a lot about the cultures that existed in the past. We learn a lot about the different events that affected life. Human beings at the most basic level are very in tune with their environment and are very affected by changes in the environment, and their technology reflected that. But also we're also affected by the events that occur in our own lives. And in modern times, the best way of determining what events were having an impact on the culture is through the buildings that they constructed. And so the buildings serve the same purpose as the baskets and the projectile points and the other things out there. And if an archaeologist came up here and in 1,000 years, and for some reason the base had been abandoned and been covered up in sand dunes or whatever, and they came upon it, they could tell a lot about the base from the buildings that were built during different decades. What you see up here is a map of Main Station China Lake, and the different colors correspond to the decades in which they were built. Unfortunately, when I was creating this map this morning, I know that legends belong in that corner right over here. And in order to fit that in there, it was a little small. So when I came in this morning to load the program on the computer, I said, well, I'll just bring in some sheets of paper because obviously it will, you'll show it better there. Oddly enough, it looks the same on paper. I'm just going to explain a little bit here. You see these green buildings, this color green here. These are all the buildings that were originally built in the 1940s, essentially from the period of about 1945 to 49. The next series of buildings, you can't see them really well. They're kind of a light blue. These would be these types of buildings right up in here. They were built in the 50s. The reds up in here were built in the 1960s, and so on. We're pretty much going to deal in this discussion with the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. Okay, let's try to start off with the next slide here. Every good story starts off with once upon a time. Unfortunately, this is a technical discussion, and once upon a time is not very good for archaeological technical discussions. We like to get down within at least a couple thousand years of the actual date. Being an archaeologist is very much like being a detective working in any police department, except that we use our skills to solve mysteries in time. And we use the same investigative techniques as any group of detectives out there, whether they be at the FBI or LA detectives, and I imagine in Ridgecrest as well. So the primary objective of every archaeological or historical investigation is to develop a chronology of events. And understanding the materials, design, and construction techniques associated with those buildings and structures can assist in establishing a timeline. Additionally, buildings and structures reflect the periods in which they were constructed. What a lot of people don't know is that you can get a lot of information from a lot of places you don't expect. If you take a look at this picture right here, that's actually a rail from the railroad that's located just to the west of this location. There used to, if you didn't know it, there was a railroad spur that was off the main line up here, Southern Pacific. They built off that and they came right to the back of Mike Lab and to the warehouse district, and actually went around to the north of us. For safety reasons, often what they did on these rails was they stamped the manufacturer, who manufactured that rail, and the year that they manufactured that rail in. Down here you'll see you'll see the words, maybe not so well, but it says basically Lackawanna. That was the company that produced it. The year, 1944. Now we know the history of this base, and we know that in itself, that date, 1944, is important because that's the point where they're actually moving from Inyokern down to this base. And in order to get the men and materials that they needed to do down, they had to build this railroad. So you can get your dates off a lot of different things out there. Fortunately, in history, we do this. Next slide, please. Yeah, Houston, we got a little problem here. I just got done telling you that these were a great indicator of age. One of the problems is that sometimes these finds can provide conflicting information. In this particular case, if you'll take a look at this rail, and this rail is located about 100 meters to the south of the rail I just told you, it says Carnegie, 1907. Unfortunately, this happens a lot in my line of work, and sometimes it's easy to explain why that happens. Like in a lot of times in prehistoric sites, they're just like us. They see something out there they could use. They just picked it up and they took it to their site, they used it, they dropped it, and now we have a site with 1,500-year-old projectile points in it, but we have this little anomaly where we also have this 8,000-year-old projectile point. And it's not located along the lakes where it should be. It's located in the uplands where it has no business being in the first place. So sometimes you run into situations, but because I'm responsible for explaining this, I do have to come up with a reasonable explanation. And I do have one, oddly enough. Next slide, please. Oh, yeah, never mind, we found the tang. Sometimes the answer is associated with a period in which the feature was constructed. Between 1941 and 1945, we were involved in the war. There was a small problem with having enough metals for the war effort. In fact, every piece of scrap was going into developing the weapons of war and supporting the troops. So one of the things they did is that the U.S. government always maintains a log of every railroad out there. And there's actually an agency that controls that, of course. And so they pretty much knew where all the abandoned railroads were in the United States. Now, back in 1944, the railroads were a primary source of transportation. So if you had a rail rail system and it connected New York City and Boston, all that stuff, it's unlikely that you'll find any abandoned railroads. But one place they could find them was actually out in the National Forest located in the Northwest and out in northern Arizona and in southern New Mexico. Railroad logging was a big industry from about 1900 to 1940s. This is before the large trucks were really popular for use. And these companies, they would go out and they'd set up these railroads all the way through national forest. And in fact, if you ever go to central, any place up in Oregon really, pretty much on the, central to eastern Oregon, and you go out and you drive on these roads through the forest, you're likely to be really riding on an old railroad grade. And I can't tell you when I was working in the Forest Service how many times I had to change flats for people because they had a railroad spike in their wheel. And they'd always ask me, this is insane. Who would come out here and drop a railroad spike on this out in the middle of nowhere? And it was like, well, if you take some time to look around, you're going to find quite a few spikes down this road because it's an old railroad grade. So what they did was they went out there, they picked up the rails, and in this particular case, instead of melting them down, they brought them to China Lake and used them to fill in the gaps where there were not enough rails available. So that's the explanation in this particular case on why there's a little anomaly when you go out there and look at the rails. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, this construction of buildings located on China Lake. Really, buildings are a great indicator of vision. They are the vision of the individuals that were either paying for the building or, in this particular case, the two strongest personalities in the early development of China Lake, Captain Burroughs and Dr. Lauriston. Did I say that right? Or I'll just say Dr. Lauriston. These guys, they knew what they wanted for this base. And if you ever get a chance to read some of the history of China Lake, and in the two publications are out now, these guys really made this place happen. And so when you take a look at these buildings, you're really seeing what they wanted. Okay, next slide, please. Materials. Materials are very important because they go to vision as well, and the thoughts of the people that originally were working here on base. If you know something about the two buildings, this one happens to be the quarterdeck. This building here, I don't know where that is. No, of course this is Mike Lab. But you'll notice that they're both made out of concrete. You say, yeah, well, big deal. That's no big deal. There's hundreds of buildings out there made of concrete. It is a big deal because it notes permanency. If you ever, I don't know, you probably don't go around spending a lot of time at different bases looking at their buildings or maybe even checking into their history. But one thing you'll note about buildings that were built in World War II, they were not built of concrete. I don't care if you go to Fort Knox, Fallon, San Diego, any of these places. They were not built of concrete. They were made out of what they're called temporary buildings. And the reason for that is that the United States government had no intention of maintaining NAS Fallon at the end of World War II. They were going to drop that off. All these little bases were developed through the West here, basically in response to Japanese attack to Pearl Harbor. They were temporary and temporary only. As soon as the war was done, they were going. By building these out of concrete, that was a statement. We're not going anywhere. We're here. This base is gonna, the rest of them can go away, but this one's gonna stay. So materials has a lot to do with the future and people's visions. Next slide, please. Hey, what's with all these flat roofs? I mean, they're really only good for leaking, right? Well, that is true, and I deal with a lot of leaking buildings. But essentially, there's a reason for that. in keeping with tradition, generally all the way up to World War II, all the bases, the Bureau of Yards and Docks, essentially they developed a theme for a particular base. They would, if you go back to Annapolis, everything, or Annapolis or the Washington shipyards, everything is made out of brick. And they want to, you know, so everything has to be made out of brick, every new building. And that's why when we get this is really great. I was putting up a fence on a project, and I said, so what's the fencing material? And they said, well, we're having a little problem with that. And I said, really? I mean, is there a real problem deciding that it's going to be chain link or barbed wire? And they said, well, that's not really the problem. I said, what is the problem? They said, well, it's NAVFAC. And I said, well, yeah, okay. And they said, yeah, according to NAVFAC, everything has to be made out of brick. All new walls have to be made out of brick. I was like, what? And they said, yeah, well, and it turns out the reason that is that because they work out the Washington Naval shipyards. Everything's made out of brick. They just, and since they never go anywhere, they just assume everybody else is made out of brick. So, but every building built between, you know, from after the Revolution up to 1945, every naval facility has a specific theme. So all the buildings are built in 1940. They were all going to look like this. All right? But more interesting enough, I'm not sure that the Bureau of Yards and Docks didn't have a little bit of help in choosing that theme. And the reason is that the theme of China Lake is self-consciously modern. Why? Well, it says right out there, we do rocket scientists. We do rocket science. We're looking to the future. We are the future, and we want buildings on this base that reflect that. We don't, and they made sure that followed through, because there is no attempt anywhere on this base except for in one location to incorporate historical architectural styles into the working facilities. Everything is in this style here. And the only place there's an exception, is actually not a working facility, is the senior scientist and officers' quarters. And that's the Spanish colonial revival type style, which is very much similar to the officers' quarters they built at the same time down in San Diego. I guess they had the plans already, so they might as well do the same thing up here. So because of what China Lake was established to do, they really wanted to show that this was the future. And this was their vision of the future. Now, after World War II, those barriers broke down. No longer were bases required to build the buildings in the same way that they were previously. And there's a good reason for that, and we're going to get into it a little bit later. But the interesting thing about China Lake is that almost every building that we build today is still this way. Where other bases have gone ahead and built a lot of their main facilities and things are all different types of architectural styles. Ours is still done in the international style. So flat roofs are here to stay, although we've worked out a deal where we can get a little bit of a pitch in the center of it so it runs off to the side, but it still looks flat. So like I said, this is the only base that still retains integrity related to its original architectural theme. So next slide please. The international style. Developed in the 1920s and 30s, had its origins with some of the more famous architects out there. Essentially, it was their vision of the future as well. And generally, the general characteristics of this type of architectural style is rectilinear forms. Everything has got to be square. Open interior spaces. A lot of these buildings were originally designed with open interior spaces. I haven't walked through my lab, but I understand it's turned into a kind of a cubicle farm like the rest of the buildings here on base. Large expanses of glass and steel, reinforced concrete construction, top plane surfaces devoid of applied ornamentation. So basically, nothing out there to catch your eye. Just go in the building and go to work. There's nothing to distract you there. Now in Europe, they were big on form equals function. I know a lot of us here, we've been trained a lot to do form and function. If you study anatomy or even forensic science and you're studying bones, it's all about form and function. Now this is, like I said, primarily found in Europe, but actually we have two very good examples of that here on base. First is Mike Lab. Mike Lab has a very interesting history behind its overall design and construction. It actually wasn't designed by anybody out in this area. It was designed by one guy back in Washington, D.C. And during World War II, he made 24 round trips from Washington, D.C. out here just to make sure that Mike Lab turned out the way it was. And his vision for Mike Lab was what you see here today. But in each one of those wings, there would be labs. And his vision was that any experiment you wanted to conduct related to chemistry, physics, whatever, could be conducted in any one of those labs. He wanted a place that was just pure for science, and he designed what he thought was the best building to do that. If you take a look at the admin building or the quarterdeck, it looks like a building that's an administrative center. And so its form equals its function as well. Okay, next slide, please. Oh yeah, how the U.S. military, how U.S. military construction changed the world. I tell people that, and they look at me like, you know, you're just absolutely insane. But really, World War II changed everything about what was known. Well, everything we knew about construction in the past. I love the slide here. I call it Dad and Son, or Father and Son. This Quonset hut being the father, and this wonderful prefabricated building that's been attached to it is the son. If you don't know what this is actually a building that's located about 5 miles east of here. And this Quonset hut was the warehouse for Project Camel. Project Camel was actually, if you don't know, was actually a special project under the Manhattan Project that was conducted here at China Lake. And essentially it did two things. One, it tested out the aerodynamics of the first atomic bombs, or excuse me, not the first, but the Fat Boy. I think it's the fusion bomb that was dropped on Nagasaki. And the other thing is that, you know, it was pretty hard. You know, atomic bombs aren't the easiest thing to explode, and China Lake worked that problem out. So there were a couple tests conducted here in base, and it was called Project Camel. So this was the warehouse. Believe it or not, it's on the National Register of Historic Places. I actually just did a project on these two buildings, and I cannot tell you the discussions I had with people related to this. They just couldn't believe it, that we would actually do something crazy like that. But more important than its association with that is actually the construction that's associated with it. Modern construction relies heavily on the construction techniques that were developed by the military in World War II. And many of the bases built in World War II only consisted of these Quonset huts. I mean, if you ever take a look at Fallon, it was nothing but a Quonset hut farm out in the middle of some alfalfa fields. The design for these temporary buildings basically followed 6 principles: cost, speed, simplicity, conservation, flexibility, and safety. In order to meet these things, these plans came with standardized. These buildings came with standardized plans. Were often prefabricated, and were constructed by crews that specialized in one aspect of the construction process. So basically, they had framers, then they had the roofers, Then they had electricians. Everybody had a specific job, and that's the only job they did. Prior to World War II, if you were to go out and build your own home, if you're going to put up a Craftsman home that you ordered out of the Sears catalog, which you could do, that's where they got that name from, you would have to do all this stuff yourself, or you'd hire a crew and they would do it. There was no special, there might have been one or two people that are specialized in a certain aspect of construction, but generally they were a jack of all trades. But they found out that you can actually build buildings like assembling a Model T on the assembly line. And they applied those same principles to construction. And today, if you go through any one of these construction sites out there, you're going to say, what do you do? Well, I'm a roofer. Well, what else do you do? I'm a roofer. That's all they do. And so all these homes that are being built since World War II, it's just an assembly line. They work, one crew starts, the framers come in and they do their thing, and the next people come in, they put their job is to put in the hard boards and all the rest of that stuff. So really, the military developed the construction techniques that we use today. It also did a number of other things. It also introduced new types of materials to buildings that had not been previously used, and those consisted of plywood, hardboard, sheetrock, asbestos cement, and corrugated metal. Now, corrugated metal is nothing new. It was not new at this time. It actually had been around for a long time. But usually the only places you'll ever see it are associated with mining camps. So miners knew about corrugated metal, and they use it quite frequently in the construction of their houses, along with, you know, things like the remains of cyanide cans and other things. But they love the corrugated metal, and it's very rare that you'll go to a mining site where you won't see at least some part of that house made out of that material. Not always on the roof. So for the rest of America, they were introduced to this wonder material. Okay, next slide. Oh yeah, families, we love them, sort of. If you were in the military prior to World War II, the military's general attitude towards families was, or at least I've heard many times, if the Army had wanted you to have a family, we would have issued you one. And in fact, I was told that in the 1980s at Fort Irwin. But the Cold War, basically a period of time between, it's generally 1948 up till 1998, really changed the military attitudes towards families. And the reason that it changed wasn't, basically they were forced to, because essentially America's attitudes towards large standing armies had changed. All the way up until the Cold War, Americans did not want a large standing military force. They were very much against a large standing military force because of all and dating back to the Revolution and the British soldiers walking around Boston and everything. America had a very negative attitude towards a large standing force. And so as a result, anytime we'd have these wars and then everybody disappear. You know, all the soldiers would go home. There was just, you know, a couple thousand guys in the military. And you hear all about all these cavalry battles back in the 1870s and 60s on the plains. That was done by an army of maybe 5,000 people. And most of those were in supply. So basically after, you know, the Civil War, you'd have armies of 6 million men, would dwindle down to 5,000. But because the government saw Russian expansion as such a problem, they decided a large standing force is what they needed. But you're not going to get and maintain a large standing force of guys who, you know, you basically tell them, well, yeah, I know you're 22, but you can have a family when you're 48 and, you know, you can get out. They're just not going to tolerate it. So they said, okay, we're going to have to build some homes. So Congress passed two funding acts, the first being the Weary Act in 1949, and the second one being the Capehart Act of 1955. Now I know some of the people in here lived in some of those Capehart houses. How many people grew up on China Lake? Yeah. So you all lived in those Capehart houses. And I'll tell you a story about housing. When I was up at Fallon, Captain Ryder called me into his office. And when the base commander calls you in the office, you know it's not for drinks. He said, Baskerville, I understand that you're giving my people a lot of hassle about tearing down these houses. And I said, yeah, oh, yes, sir, definitely. And he goes, can you please explain to me why you think these houses are so precious? And I said, well, if you give me a drink, I might be able to.
Ain't over a barrel on that one.
But essentially the reason that archaeologists and historians and the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation and a lot of historical societies out there think that these houses are so special is that they serve as the blueprint for every house that was ever designed after World War II. Essentially, the way these houses were built, they were built adapting the same methods that were used for constructing the temporary housing or the temporary buildings out there on base during World War II. They introduced new materials like vinyl siding. They created the novel idea of actually including air conditionings in the houses and selling the houses with appliances. These were all ideas that were developed for military housing. And the civilian contractors who did this, oh, one more other thing, all these houses look the same, right? They're all built the same. You can orientate them any way you want, but it's still a 2-bedroom house with a tiny kitchen with the cupboards about 12 feet off so no one can get into them and things like that. I mean, you could walk, no wonder if you were stumbling around in the dark for some reason outside and you went into someone's houses, no one could really blame you for doing that. So all those factors the civilians took out into the real world. And when the baby boom started happening and the market for housing was really being pushed up, they said, well, yeah, well, we did this for the military. It worked for the military. It will work out here for these folks. So essentially, and not only, well, I'll go one more further. Also, you'll know something about the communities that were built here in the 50s. The streets aren't lined up like this. They don't go north, south, and east and west. And the houses, they kind of curve around and everything like that, and they have the little parks in between and things like that. So not only were they building houses, but they were designing communities here on the military bases. They took the houses, they took those planned communities, they took them out there. And I guarantee if you live off this base, which I think everybody here does, all right, you essentially are living in a system, a house and a community that was planned for the military. So all these houses and all these communities are the blueprint for the suburbs that grew up and everything that went in them. So that's why a lot of historians and a lot of people think it's important, because this is the origin of what's happened in the houses and communities in the last 60 years. All right? All right, I think that's about the end of my story. It's kind of short, I guess, but are there any questions?
I had one. With all the building that we're seeing here in China Lake now, are they still using the same international?
Yes.
So that's going to stay there's nobody going to come and make some kind of a weird building. They're going to keep it international with the rack buildings and everything.
Yeah, in fact, you know, a lot of people think I spend a lot of time out there recovering the golden idols that people buried out on China Lake, and yes, that is an important part of my job. But really, a lot of one of my biggest jobs is I go to all these meetings, and I play a part in the design teams that go into those. And my biggest part is when the architects come in and they start talking about the nice pitched roof and all this stuff. I'm the guy that says, yeah, that's not going to happen. So if you like the international style, thank you. If you don't like it, well, I don't, that's just the way it's going to be. So that's part of my job, is to make sure that we maintain that integrity in design. In fact, the reason that you're not going to be able to be parking in this far parking lot is because they actually are going to be in there. And I spent the day in a design planning meeting, and that's going to be in the international style too. So there's not going to be, and there's actually 2 other buildings going in. Those will also be in the international style. If you build something in close proximity to Mike Lab or the headquarters building, and it's not in that style, under the laws as they apply to historic resources, you could actually have an adverse effect. You want to maintain it so it doesn't distract away from the historic buildings in the area.
Well, we hear about the Capehart and Wary housing that kind of abandoned next to the fairgrounds, and that was an eyesore and probably a fire hazard. Is there anybody actually trying to preserve any of those, so there's at least a few examples left?
No, not as far as I know.
There's a few examples of the old duplexes that used to be on the base. Those are the ones that were out there at the fairgrounds. And actually, as you're going down Richmond Road, there were some of those that were purchased and restored and are used for housing right along that road. You can see the old duplexes out there.
Yeah,
There's another one that's out in Indiacre.
I used to work for a group that had their office was in one of those old duplexes, but I think they're all torn down a few years ago.
Most of them are, but
Yeah,
there are still a
Parsons
few
is
out
gone.
in town.
Yeah.
Yeah, federal preservation laws, historic preservation laws, only apply primarily to federal lands. Now, if someone decided to tear those down and they were using federal money to do that, then the federal laws would apply. But generally, if it's out there on private land, people have the right to do what they want to do on their own. So.
Can you estimate how many nationally historic registered facilities we have, or buildings we have on base?
I can tell you, yes, I can tell you exactly what we have. Currently, we have Mike Lab, the headquarters building, Bennington Theater, and the old hospital, which is no longer there, was one of those buildings.
That doesn't guarantee preservation then?
It does not guarantee preservation, but it does guarantee that it's going to cost you quite a bit more to tear it down. So generally people avoid doing that, and another part of my job is to make sure that even in as far as Mike Lab and the headquarters buildings, is to make sure that they don't change the features within those buildings. If you change a feature within a particular building, it alters the story of that particular building. And particularly when it comes to windows and doors. If you move windows and doors, that's a death to a historic building. And a good example of that is Grove School, the main building down there. The Grove School that you see today is not, even though it was, it's the same building, it was built in '48. They've moved the windows and doors in that building. So once you do that, that building is no longer considered eligible to the National Register of Historic Places because it alters it so much that it can't convey its historic significance. It can't help interpret the history of China Lake.
So we only have about 5 or 6 buildings that are...
Yeah, no, we have 5 or 6 individual buildings here on Main Station that they're individually eligible to the National Register. However, we also have on Main Station, well, not on Main Station, but in this vicinity, we have 3 historic districts, and they are the senior officers and scientist quarters, the China Lake Propulsion Lab, and the salt wells. So if you were actually going to Salt Wells or down there or the China Lake Propulsion Plant, individually, a lot of them have been modified. You can go and you take a look at the windows, and you know they weren't built in the 1940s. But as a group, they contribute to the historic significance of the area. And there was a lot of work that was done down there. So almost 90% of all the buildings down in the Clip and down in the Salt Wells area are actually have been determined eligible for National Register. But basically only actually a nomination form was filled out for those two areas, plus all the individual buildings here on base. How many of you have been on the South Range? You notice those big wooden towers out there? Now, do you know that they're the largest freestanding wooden towers in the world? Those two are eligible to the National Register. And all the forms have been filled out. They were sent back to Washington, D.C. 5 years ago, and they haven't moved on them. They just kind of sit there and hide them in the drawer.
Okay, because the firehouse out there at Clip, I remember they were going to tear it down, and I thought they had made it a historical. They stopped it. We couldn't tear it down, which is
well,
good.
we don't stop what you're going to do, but we do make you account for your actions, meaning that we initially fill out a form that's very general, but when we go ahead and register them, it's a little more formal and go in a little more detail. If you're going to tear something down like that, you're going to be out there measuring this building inch by inch. So
They didn't.
it's very difficult to take them down. There's nothing in the law that prevents you from doing it, but you're going to pay a hefty price. And there's only the only historic properties in the United States that you can't destroy are actually designated that by Congress. Now, there are 3 buildings in the United States in which the National Historic Preservation Act does not apply to. Does anyone want to give a guess on which 3 buildings that is? Supreme Court.
So I could actually tear down the Washington Monument.
You'd have a little problem with that. It might not be against the law, but you'll have to put down the riots forcibly.
A friend of mine worked here years ago, and he talks about buildings called the Bishops. That they refer to them as the Bishops. And he thinks they're from Manzanar because anytime you see pictures of that are contemporary when the camp was open, you see the Bishops there. And he claims there's a few on the base. Has they ever been able to find the provenance of those, maybe whether they did come from Manzanar or not?
I haven't seen those buildings.
Okay.
I've never run into like the Bishop buildings. Maybe that's what they're called down here. I know up in Tonopah, Nevada, they're called Babbitt houses and things like that. And a lot of those buildings you find at Manzanar are the same type of buildings you'll find at the Hawthorne Depot, and they move around quite a bit. But if a building, this is one of the other things, if a building is moved, it's no longer eligible for the National Register either.
Oh, well, I was thinking if they ever found out their provenance is really Manzanar,
Yeah.
someone wanted to pay National Park Service, then you could move them back to Manzanar because there's very little original Manzanar left. When you
Right.
go up there, you see the community building, and that's about it.
Yeah, and even if you did move them back to Manzanar, they still won't be eligible because they've been moved from their original location. So unless you know exactly where those houses came from and you orientate them in the same direction, the thing is that once you move a historical or archaeological object, and you even mess around with its orientation, you really alter the story, and that site is trying to convey. So by moving anything, you lose the story, and that's why we get very uptight about people taking things or moving things or altering things, because we want to make sure that when future generations come here, they get the same story. When they walk down the Clip, we want to make sure that they know that this thing was built in the 40s, late 40s, and this is the type of activities that went down there. And if you go around changing windows, doors, roofs, and things like that, it makes it very hard to tell the story.
Is there anything left of the railroad engine turntable that used to be here on the base, or the central steam plant that remotely heated buildings in this area?
I don't know about the steam building, but I do know that the engine house is still here.
Does it have the turntable in it still?
They won't let me go in it.
Really? They won't let you go in?
Where is it?
They won't
Actually,
tell you.
it's just, if you go to the we know where the warehouse is. Well, actually, here's a better way to get there. There's at the back gate, you have the guard station back there, right? And then you have this road that goes along those metal buildings and goes out back. Just follow that road out towards the gate, and just before you hit the gate, stop because it is always locked. Look to your right, and there's a very large yellow building with a pitched roof on it, and that's the old locomotive house. And it's I said, well, I'm going there, and they said, no, you're not, because there's like, if you walk in there, you'll die, because there's asbestos dust and things in there, and plus there's rats and there's bird poop and everything. So, but I said I'd really like to go inside, and they said, well, we really prefer that you not. So, one of these days when no one's looking, I probably will go in there, but I'll hold my breath.
You know, that brings up another question, is if you get something assigned to this historic register, shouldn't that also come with some responsibility to take care of it? You mentioned the Station Theater, and what I've heard, it may just be hearsay, but we don't use it anymore. If we want to have a large meeting, we'd use the chapel or something else, because there's no place to do it. And yet, NAVFAC, or I'm not sure who, but I have been told that there is no money to restore it, and it's a hazard. It's got all the things you just mentioned.
Yes.
So, you know, you've got a historic thing, but you can't go near it, and you probably have to stay further and further away from it as time goes on.
Bennington Theater is one of my projects that I have now, and that is actually a building that's owned by CNIC down in San Diego.
Well, the whole base is, right?
No. There are certain buildings that they do. There are certain buildings owned by NAVFAC. There's certain buildings owned by CNIC. There's certain buildings owned by NAVAIR. There happens to be one that's owned by San Diego. And because it's owned by San Diego, Admiral Herring, he's under pressure from Congress to reduce the footprint of the base. Essentially, if we don't, for every new building that we build, some building has to go down. That's been mandated by Congress. So he's getting all these requests, and he's getting all he's got pressure, one from Congress and two from folks up here. We need new buildings. Our flat roof building leaks like a sieve and it smells bad to boot. Okay, so what is he going to do? He has to tear a building down. When Bennington Theater was abandoned, the roof collapsed and it had all these problems. You can see what he was thinking. This is a building with a large footprint. He wants that thing gone, and he wants it gone bad. So Admiral Herring and I have an arrangement. We don't talk to each other. So when I came here to China Lake, I had two things going on, and one was Bennington Theater, and he essentially sent me a message through his adjutant that he wanted that building down, and he wanted to make sure that I took care of it. My response was, well, first, it's eligible for National Register. It's even had the actual documentation out there. And he goes, well, it's just very simple. Just remove it. Once you put a building on there, you can't remove it, at least in government circles. If you're a private individual and your building's on there, you can do anything you want with it. But when in government, it's like it's permanent. And so I said, fine. And he said, what do we have to do this? And I said, well, we need to come up with a budget. We need to come up with a justification. So they went and did a really quick economic analysis, and it turned out that in this particular case that they said that they could, even though it's a hazmat thing, they had to clean up the hazmat even when they're tearing it down. All that stuff's got to be gone. And they need to collapse the building, and they need to haul it off to a dump and pay to have the material put in there. They claim that that would be cheaper than actually rebuilding it. And all you're doing when you're rebuilding is you have to gut it out, you have to clean it. All you got to do is put a new roof on it, put the wiring in, put new seats and things like that in there. So there was a lot of people that questioned the economic analysis, showed that it was not feasible to save it. So that's what's happening, is that there's an economic analysis. We're going to see actually if it's cheaper, because there is a need for a meeting place here on base, whether it's easier to go ahead and rehab those buildings, that building, and rather than tear it down and actually build a new building of that that size. So I know one of the things I told people down there was, I said, you know, this is not a regular base. A lot, you know, this base had a lot of families in it. A lot of people have very emotional ties. I cannot tell you how many people have told me, I can't believe you're allowing that building to go down. I said, I'm not allowing anything. So yeah, don't get too excited yet. It's still alive and kicking.
You had a building collapse up at Cliff, take that one.
It's already gone.
Already gone.
It's gone.
Financially.
Yeah, nothing, you know, one thing about China Lake, I noticed that if something falls down, it's not allowed to lay on the ground very long. It's hauled off. Yeah, there were some real, as I understand, some real issues associated with the building, and they had to work that out before they can go in there. So.
How about the Officers Club? I know it's now the site of the museum, but
Yeah.
you know, someday in the future they hope to move the museum. But that building goes back to the beginning too, doesn't it?
Yeah, and here's another thing. The Navy does have a policy of reuse, and they're very good at it, or at least back east they're very good at it. A little west, we're having a little problem with that. We're not, being from the west, we never look backwards. We always look to the future, and we're not too attached to our history. So we're willing to take it down. You know, one of the things we have to do is we have to prove that this building cannot be reused. So if there's a possible reuse for that building and someone's willing to rehab that building, you'll probably stay.
Who does that belong to?
I don't know. I could look. I could check it very
Curious.
easily.
Are there other isolated buildings that are eligible for this?
There are well, there's a few out there on the ranges. There are lots of buildings. I actually have a map down the facility that shows all the eligibility of the buildings located here on base. Now, there's always more ineligible buildings on anywhere you go than there are eligible, but there are a few.
Which
There's-
ones specifically are eligible? Do you know about?
Let's see, we already talked about like land. You know, I'm just thinking the only ones I can think about right now are the ones that I already mentioned.
Stuff out on the airfield?
There's probably 3. Hangar 1 is one of those that's eligible as a National Register.
Anything at the South Ranges? I know in association with those wooden towers is the gun line in some of the buildings there where they used to use those guns to shoot at things they hung up between those towers.
Right. The towers themselves have been evaluated as being eligible. The rest of the facilities, I don't think they ever actually addressed the gun line when they went through there. They were more interested in buildings and structures, so they haven't gotten to that part yet.
Too bad they blew up the other 2 wooden towers.
They tried to blow them up.
Well, they went up like this and came back down and burned and then fell over. I was there when that happened.
The skipper looked at the
I
guy
vote
who blew it up
for-
and he said, they're still too tall.
I vote for sometime in the future, it's not a building, but to certainly keep the snort track forever as some sort of historical.
It's a snort track. Sorry, snort track is also a historic district.
Yeah,
so
because
if you're worried about
that's
that,
really
then-
old and really unique.
If you can bet that it adds, the snort track, the headquarters, Mike Lab, all these buildings, you might notice a little pattern here. They all contribute significantly to the history of the base, and all those facilities out there like Snort and the rest of them, they have been evaluated, and Snort is a historic district, so that's taken care of as well.
How about Thompson Lab?
Thompson Lab, yes. If you name a building, you could do it, but I'll never.
I think Mesa probably is. That
But
big
it's new.
tall.
That's the
It's
building.
new, but
Yeah,
it's pretty unique.
the criteria here, a building doesn't necessarily have to be 50 years old, but when you're evaluating a building, you really have to look at certain periods of events. You know, really, it has to be related to a significant part of the development of China Lake.
This is not yet.
So if it's something new, if it's anything that was built after probably 1958, it's going to have a very difficult time being eligible to the National Register.
For a while.
Anything in your current from previous when it was out there, or is that all?
Yeah. That's true, and not, as far as I know, no one's ever gone out there to take a look at those, because it's no longer federal lands. Essentially, it's been given over to the county, so they maintain there, and I really don't have the, well, I could go over and say, hey, how about doing this, and they probably tell me to get lost, but yeah, Indian Kern definitely has played a large role in history, and unfortunately, a lot of these old World War II bases played a huge role in World War II. Anybody here ever been to Tonopah, Nevada? There's a base out there. It's the old Tonopah Army Airfield, and initially it was designed to train fighter pilots, but by 1943 it had been converted to train B-24 pilots. If you ever read Chuck Yeager's biography, he learned to fly out of Tonopah, but there's something else very interesting about that base. On the far end, there's these old wooden hangars, the old cedar wooden hangars. And inside those hangars, there's one that's surrounded by a barbed wire fence, even to this day. They developed some of the first radio and television wire guided bombs out there in that hangar. And they were tested out in a place called Stone Cabin Valley. And if you want to see these bombs, you can actually do that, because two brothers, the Metcher brothers, decided that they didn't like the fact that these things were rotting out there in the middle of Nevada, so they went out and collected them, and they put them out front of the Central Nevada Museum. So you can go to Central Nevada Museum when you're in Tonopah, you can see the first television and wire-guided bombs.
There's a pad over the museum, which is that thing together.
Right. And these were, interestingly enough, developed by the Baldwin Piano Company. They weren't selling very many pianos in World War II, so they had to diversify.
What about the old mining activities that were done in this area? Is there any effort to try and preserve that history?
Sure. We also have a very active range program. I deal a lot with the main station because this is where a lot of the money goes as far as construction. So a lot of my time is spent addressing the effects of these projects on the buildings, the historic buildings. But I also spend a lot of time in range. And in fact, most of you probably know Russ Kallenberg. And one of the things, when he was here, he got some money and he went out there and he actually recorded as many of the ranch buildings that he could, and also the mining buildings. So they had a pretty intensive inventory when they were done here. So we have documentation related to that.
The criteria you were talking about a minute ago seems kind of subjective. So is there some kind of committee that decides these things, to be on the register?
Well, they're not really subjective. Now, the way that people nominate sometimes is pretty subjective, but there are 4 criteria for eligibility. 1, it has to be related to significant event or trend. 2, it has to be related to an individual significant to history. 3, it has to be a building or a building object, or even a piece of art that is a work of a master, or a really great example of that type of architecture. Or D, it has to have research potential. Now, those seem kind of subjective, but because there's a lot of events related to history, but it has to play a very significant part to a significant event. So if it's related to World War II, if the building is eligible because it's related to World War II and a specific type of development of technology, that technology has to be pretty important to make that building eligible. So when you're going through there, that's why I say 90% of the buildings on this base are not eligible. It's only those parts of the base that really contribute to the history of testing and other things that they did here in World War II and during the Cold War. And if they're not related to that, chances are they'll never be historical unless there's another really big war and we start cranking out a lot of research related to different weapon systems.
What about the Cold War?
Yeah, Cold War, definitely. Cold War is another one of those periods, and one of the things that there are specific traits associated with these trends, and I mentioned one, and that was large standing army. That was a result of the Cold War. But technological development in the Cold War really is something significant. So that is one of those things. If you have a building that really is related to radar systems and things like that were developed during that period of time, or any type of weapons like Sidewinder or whatever, that building would be eligible because of that. Fallon has one. It's actually part of the SAGE system. It was an early warning system for TAC, and that's the only buildings. There's about 6 of them that are eligible up there in Fallon. The rest of the buildings on Fallon aren't eligible.
Okay, last one.
Okay, you know, is the USO building out in town, is it on the National Register?
They are in the process.
They're in process.
Yeah, and I get calls every once in a while. And so, yeah, they are in the process, and Larry Paul's got that under control out there. And he just calls me every once in a while just to ask for some advice.
Okay, well, Mike, thank you very much. I have a poster for you of the
Thank you.
presentation today and a certificate thanking you. Mike also would like volunteers. They have a curation facility that they have here on the base, and on Flex Fridays, you could take volunteers to help do some work.
Yeah, we do some projects down there, and the only thing I can offer you in exchange is that when you work for me or you volunteer for me, I always have to go out and monitor a lot of resources, and so you get access to a lot of the places out there, the archaeological sites that most people don't.
So if you want to talk to Mike about that afterwards, I'm sure he will have some information for you.
Thank you.
And thank you. This is our 18th presentation, and we have been recording each of them. So if you want to stop past the desk, if there's some that you haven't seen, we do have them on DVD, and you can check them out. Thanks. Bye-bye.